I invite during this presentation, I invite anyone that has questions along the way. Jean, I don't know how you want to modulate the question asking, but I really like to invite people to participate as I talk, because it helps me guide what I'm going to be talking about, because I could talk so much for hours and hours and hours about all of this stuff.
So I think if you're open to questions while you're talking, people can just unmute themselves and interrupt you. Would you be all right with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love to make it a dialogue. That's really how I think we all get the most out of talking about fungi, is to have a back and forth dialogue about them. But without further ado, I will open up my slides. I'll do a screen share. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen right now? Yep, cool. Great. I'm adopting these slides from some other presentations I've done. These slides are pretty elaborate, but I might just go through, depending on how much time we have, I might just kind of go through more of the basics and really give an introduction to fungi rather than going into the nitty-gritty science parts, because sometimes it can just get it can just be so much information at once and everyone's like, I don't know what to do with all this information. So my goal today is really to just introduce you all to the fungal realm, kind of talk about their biology and ecology a little bit, why they're important, and then really just open the door for your curiosity. Open the door so that you can feel inspired and follow whatever threads of curiosity that you have. So yes, these are mushrooms. You all will probably see this picture and yeah, at first glance recognize, oh, these are mushrooms. And they are mushrooms. They come in all sorts of sizes and shapes and colors and expressions. And they're so beautiful. They're so mystical and ephemeral and inspirational. And you know, while I love the above ground mushrooms that we can see, what I really want to also introduce today is this whole underground world of fungi, because fungi are not just mushrooms. And I'll talk about this later. All mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. A lot of fungi exist underground, outside of view, working in the soil, creating relationships with plants, and really like working to create the rich, fertile soil that us gardeners use to have happy plants. So much of it involves these fungi that actually don't even produce mushrooms at all. And it's really fascinating to me. And I just love, just love the mystical world of the soil and of the rhizosphere, and how much goes on that we can't even see. So I'll be talking a lot about that today. Yeah, like I said, a little overview. I'm going to just talk about some fungal biology and ecology, how they play into nutrient cycles, a little bit about their life cycle, the role of fungi in the soil and gardens, how they play into nutrient cycling and how they help build our soils. If we're interested, we might talk a little bit about Mycorrhizae, which is a very, very important fungus to know about. And then how you can incorporate fungi in your garden, kind of do some applied mycology. So this is a diagram. Don't worry if you don't really understand what's going on. This is just a tree that's showing the different groups of fungi. But really all I want to say here is that there are many, many different types of fungi. Most people, hear fungi and think about mushrooms, but mushrooms, the above ground fruiting bodies that we call mushrooms, are just a small portion of this huge, elaborate kingdom of fungi. Molds are fungi, yeasts are fungi, the yeasts that brew our beers and wines and make our cheeses, these are all fungi. And they're so important. You know, there's fungi covering almost every square inch of this planet, from our faces to the inside of our microbiomes in our guts, to the surfaces of plants and trees in our hair, in the ocean. They now have found that there's a whole suite of different fungi in the ocean that's actually helping regulate the food webs in the food cycle in the ocean. So fungi are, yeah, ubiquitous worldwide, and they're so beautiful and dynamic, even if they don't, you know, produce the above ground mushrooms. There's about 120,000 described species of fungi, and it's estimated that there's anywhere, the numbers differ a lot, but anywhere from like 2 to 6 million species. So that means that with all the study that mycologists have done about fungi, we still only know about 4 to 5% of the fungi that exist on the planet. So there's a lot more to learn and uncover, and to be curious about. Who knows, there might be some fungi that we haven't discovered yet in today's modern age that might hold a compound that can reverse some type of really systemic autoimmune disease. We know that there's a lot of medicinal fungi out there, but still we haven't even scratched the surface on really bringing forth their potential. Also, I want to say fungi have been around for a very long time. I like to call them they're the ancestors of all ancestors. You know, they were here before plants on our earth. The fungi are actually what helped plants come onto earth. So this goes a little bit into just what is a mushroom. You know, we see mushrooms all over the place, and they're these beautiful beings. But mushrooms themselves are just the above ground fruiting body of the fungal organism. So just like a metaphor I like to use is if you're looking at an apple tree, the mushroom is like the apple of the apple tree. It is where in an apple, you know, there's seeds to give birth to the next generation of plant. And in a mushroom, the mushroom holds the spores. And in each one of these tiny microscopic spores lies the genetics for the next generation of mushroom. So mushrooms are literally called the fruiting body of the fungus. But most of the fungus exists underground or exists in wood. And they exist in these ever branching, weaving threads that we call hyphae. And these small white kind of microscopic threads are the vegetative body of the fungus. This is where the fungus feeds and produces enzymes and really lives most of its life cycle in the hyphal or mycelial form as this network of fungal filaments. And the mushroom is just this like very brief part of its life cycle where it's like, oh, okay, I'm ready to spread my spores into the next generation. So that's why a lot of mushrooms are very ephemeral as well. You kind of see them come up overnight and then they're gone the next day. And it's like, whoa, where are they? But the fungal mycelium, the body of the fungus, is actually still there even when there's no mushrooms. It's present in the soil. Yeah, and I won't get into too into identification. This slide itself could be like a whole hour presentation on learning how to ID mushrooms. You know, it's just as complex, if not, you know, more complex as learning how to ID plants and all the different features of plants and all the different processes. Mushrooms are yeah, just as complex, and it takes a long time to get to know all the different species and all their functions and what they do. And just like plants, you know, mushrooms, they have binomials. So they have their common names, and then they also have their scientific names, which consists of genus and species. A very common one that I use as an example here is Amanita muscaria, which is the big, beautiful, bright red one that you often see with the white speckles. It's a very, very iconic mushroom that is often in drawings, and it associates with coast live oaks in this region, but as well as pines and spruce in other regions. Yep, I think that's, and also another interesting fact about mushrooms or about fungi is they're comprised of chitin. And chitin is the same structural polymer that insects and arthropods and crustaceans are made out of. So like that hard structural polymer, that's what fungal cells are made out of, or that makes their cell wall. So they're very resilient, they're very robust. I have one right here. This is a small little red belted conch, a very incredible medicinal mushroom that's often found on pines in this region. But you can hear how tough this mushroom is, and it's because of that chitin that really gives it that toughness. It's really incredible. Any questions so far? I just want to open up for questions, different ideas, if anyone feels excited about anything so far. No? Okay. Feel free, at any point, interrupt me with questions. I love them. So this is a very general introduction to the life cycle of a mushroom. And I think it helps to see it in a diagram, because the just like plants, the life cycles are very diverse, very dynamic. But if you ever wanted to get into cultivation of mushrooms, it's important to know the life cycle of a mushroom or how they work. And I don't have my cursor here. I wish I could kind of point with my cursor, but I don't seem to have it. But anyway, so here we have, the fruit body, the mushroom, and you can see releasing from the gills of that mushroom are all these tiny little spores, and the spores fly all around. They're, pushed by winds. They're carried on the backs of animals and on humans and of insects. They're carried by rain and water, and an individual mushroom, a mushroom like this, can produce hundreds of millions, if not billions, of spores every day. They're really, really good at what they do. So all these spores fly through the air, and they will eventually end up on a surface, whether it's wood or soil or a plant, or anything in the environment. And if that surface has enough nutrients and water and sunlight and all those right conditions, the spore will germinate just like a seed does. And when the spore germinates, it sends out its long hyphal tip. And you can kind of think of them like roots. They have very different functions, but the spore sends out this hyphal thread, and it weaves through the earth or the wood or the substrate, looking for food and looking for nutrients and looking for a mate. And once these hyphal threads meet each other, when hyphae are compatible, it's really interesting. In fungi, we don't have male and female. Like there's literally no such thing as a male or a female mushroom. It's just all about genetic compatibility. And it's said that there are some mushrooms that actually have over 28,000 different mating types. So imagine an organism with like over 20,000 different genders that can all like meet and mate. It's phenomenal, how diverse and dynamic they are, and they really help to like for me personally, expand my mind when I think about gender and the possibilities of biological life. They're so incredible. So when these two genetically compatible hyphae meet, they form an even larger branching network, and it just like branches and branches and grows throughout the soil or wood or substrate, whatever they might be on, and eats and produces enzymes and just like chews away at all this organic material. And then once they've gotten their fill, or once an environmental cue is signaled by the mushroom, the mycelium will congregate and push their way out of the substrate. And then we have a young mushroom called a primordia, and that will grow into a mature mushroom that will shed its spores, and the whole cycle begins again. So that is what is happening all over the place, all the time. These unseen cycles of life are occurring everywhere, all the time.
I have a question.
Please go on. Yeah.
Can you tell me the difference between a seed and a spore?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to use it as a metaphor, but they are actually very different. So the spore is this highly durable, compact, amalgamation of genetic material. And they really do serve a similar function, the seed and the spore, like the seed of a plant and the spore of a mushroom, in the sense of they carry the genetic material for the next generation. But when it comes to like what they're made out of, and like spores can also be multinucleated. So they can have many different sets of genetics in them, unlike a seed, which usually just has like the parent genetics from the parent plant. Spores can be really dynamic in that way, and they can also withstand incredible stress in the environment. They can withstand like years of desiccation without water, and then revitalize themselves when they get water. But ultimately, seeds and spores do have a lot of similarities in their basic function. Yeah, and then out of a seed grows roots, but out of a spore grows hyphae. And there's roots and hyphae are also very different in the sense that hyphae is like the body of the fungus, and it does most of its work through the hyphae. I don't want to get too technical, but yeah, those are the main differences. Does that help clarify at all?
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
Does the hyphae act like a stem or
No.
a root, part of a root?
So the hyphae aren't the stem. If there was an analog to the stem, it would be the stipe of the mushroom, which is like the long kind of structure that keeps the mushroom upright. But the hyphae, I would compare them more to roots. They are roots. The hyphae is the branching network that's underground.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And another word for a stem with mushrooms is called a stipe. Back here, stem is also known as a stipe.
Oh.
Yeah.
So this hyphae, do they absorb water like roots?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's one of their main functions. They absorb water. They absorb nutrients. They do everything they need for the mushroom. But they also have a lot of other functions, which I'll get into in just a little bit. And I'll talk about like what makes hyphae so special and why they're different than roots.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because for a very long time in science, pretty much up until about 100 years ago, a lot of scientists kind of grouped mycology, the study of mushrooms. It was grouped under botany. So a lot of people thought that mushrooms were just these weird, funky versions of plants. And some people still think that, but they're actually very different, and for these reasons. So fungi are, this is a fancy word, but aerobic heterotrophic eukaryotes. And that really just means that they breathe air just like we do. Fungi actually inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide, while plants, they inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen. So that's a huge difference. The fungi are heterotrophic, meaning they need to get their food from the outside environment. Plants are autotrophic, so they make their own food from sunlight and water through photosynthesis. But fungi actually have to eat food from their outside environment just like we do. But the fungi do it in a really cool way where in their hyphae, you can see this really beautiful picture of mycelium right here. So imagine each of these little white tendrils, they all have the ability to exude enzymes. So they leach out these compounds that actually break down cellulose and lignin and wood, and they digest the world around them, and then they turn it into this soup, and then they absorb it back through their hyphae, and that's how they eat food. So we, as humans, we have these internal stomachs where we eat food inside, and then we digest through all of our acids inside our stomach. But fungi have external stomachs, so they exude acids and digest the world around them and then absorb it back through their bodies. So that's pretty cool. And that's the reason why there's not miles and miles and miles of wood stacked up on the planet. Fungi and bacteria are really the only organisms that can actually break down lignin. So if it wasn't for fungi, we would all, the earth would be piled with undecomposed wood. And that's a really strange thing to think of.
So yeah. The term mycelium is a bunch of hyphae. Is that what it?
Absolutely. So hyphae is the singular, and then mycelium is just a group of hyphae. So in this picture, we are looking at mycelium right now. But if you looked at one of those single strands, that would be a hyphal strand.
I don't know if you can see it. I'm trying to raise a hand. May I ask a question about poison in mushrooms?
Sure, please.
Well, I'm interested, what the above ground poison serves for the mushroom, and then as the mushroom.
Can't hear.
It's a little hard. I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm not, oh dear. I don't know where can you hear me now?
I can. Your hand was muffling it a little bit.
Hand. Okay. So then how is the poison in the mushroom neutralized once it gets below the surface of the soil and doesn't poison everything around that particular mushroom? And how is there a way that humans can tell without studying mushrooms to a significant extent? Is there a way you can recognize the poisonous types and the non-poisonous types?
Those are both very good questions. To answer your first question, so the reason why these poisonous or toxic compounds are in the mushrooms is because there's a process that mushrooms do where they congregate or coagulate their compounds in their fruiting bodies. It's just a really interesting phenomena that they do. It's something that's used in mycoremediation when we use fungi to help decontaminate the environment. The mycelium can take up toxic compounds and congregate it in their fruiting bodies. So with poisonous mushrooms, it's a very similar thing. The fruiting bodies have toxic compounds for a lot of different functions. And this is still a very kind of mysterious and unknown place in mycology. A lot of people are studying like, why do mushrooms produce the compounds that they do? And some mycologists think it's to prevent herbivory from insects, or to like last longer, to have more spore dispersal throughout their fruiting cycle. But I've never known any cases where a poisonous mushroom will toxify the soil around it. It's just not, it's not the same thing. The mycelium doesn't necessarily like exude toxic compounds into the soil. That being said, if you do identify a toxic mushroom, I wouldn't eat any of the mushrooms growing around it, because they might be sharing what's called a common mycorrhizal network. And you just don't know if they're sharing any of those constituents or compounds. It's possible. But that being said, to go into your second question, is there unfortunately isn't any general identification characteristics for poisonous mushrooms that I know of. And I don't think there is in general, because they're very different. Really, but it's not something to be too concerned about in this area. In California, there's actually only about 4 or 5 species out of the many hundreds of different edible and medicinal species that will actually kill you. Other people, sometimes people have certain allergies to certain types of mushrooms. But the amatoxin containing mushrooms, the ones that will actually do significant harm to you, there's only about 4 or 5 species. So I always recommend, if someone really wants to know and feel safe in foraging for mushrooms or in mushroom identification, to just memorize those 4 or 5 species really well, so that when you're out in the field, you can look at them and you like know those, and anytime you see them, know to stay away. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
We have oak root fungus in our neighborhood. And could you talk about the mushroom that attacks the plants that cause the oak root fungus and the plant the plant that dies?
Yeah, the oak root fungus. Are you talking about sudden oak death?
Yes, and the mushroom strangles the roots.
Oh, I don't think that's sudden oak death then, because
No, I think it's armillaria.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
okay, yeah.
It's armillaria.
Armillaria.
Yeah, armillaria is here's a nice slide. Armillaria is considered a parasitic mushroom. Here, another name for our armillaria species are honey mushrooms.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they are a very prolific parasitic mushroom. They usually only attack like already diseased or dying trees, though. It's hard for honey mushrooms to actually parasitize like a healthy living tree. But unfortunately, there are a lot of different diseases going around right now to our precious oaks, including the sudden oak death, which significantly reduces the tree's immunity. And when a tree's immunity is down and out, it's really easy for these parasitic fungi to come in, and then they kind of finish out the tree's life. So yeah, it's a very common and prolific mushroom in this area. Most of the time, in my experience, I've found them on already cut trees, or trees that are already dead and dying. But they are parasitic, and they're also edible, which is a really
Yes, I've heard that. I've heard
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
I've been told by many tree company people that armillaria is it's so prevalent in our soil in this area that basically anything you plant in the ground has the potential to be attacked by armillaria. Do you find that is true?
Well, armillaria, they're parasitic. They kind of bounce between being parasitic and what we call saprotrophic, which means eating dead or decaying organic material. So I've usually in my experience have found Armillaria, the honey mushrooms, on only trees or like very woody plants. I would not expect Armillaria to pop out of your roses or shrubs or flowers.
They do mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They
Or
do
my
mine.
carrots.
Yeah, they're not going to come out of your carrots or beets or anything. It would be very unlikely to see them in like an annual garden bed. But they really like the lignin and the wood of trees.
I
But
never
that
knew
being
there were.
said, they are very prolific, and their spores, are probably present in all soils. But just because their spores are present doesn't mean they're necessarily going to attack your trees.
So do all fungi at some point have a fruiting body above the surface of the soil?
No, they don't. So I can
Oh.
go back to this slide. If you look at this this tree of fungi, so there's like these 5 main groups of the entire fungal kingdom, and only 2 of those groups actually produce those above ground fruiting bodies.
Oh, my goodness.
So like molds and yeasts, and another type of fungi called Mycorrhizae, which I'll talk about in a little bit. A lot of them actually don't produce mushrooms at all. They live their entire life cycle totally like out of sight in the substrate or in the soil.
See, I thought that's what Armillaria did. I didn't realize it had a fruiting body associated with it.
Yeah, Armillaria definitely does. It has the fruiting body. There's multiple species in this area. The most common one is Armillaria militaris, or I'm sorry, Armillaria melia and Armillaria solitipes. And they are, both really delicious edibles. Yeah, use caution when eating any mushroom, really any mushroom, of course. But with the Armillaria, some people have allergic, like a little bit of or it can cause them some gastrointestinal upset. But I personally, I love honey mushrooms, and they're so prolific in this area. So you can pick them and try them and add them to soups and stews. And you don't really have to feel bad about over harvesting them because they're such an invasive and prolific species. Yeah. So going on a little bit more, so in this way, of living their life underground, but then when they're ready to fruit with the mushrooms kind of coming up to the light, I kind of see fungi as these beautiful bridgers of the light and the dark, and of life and death. They're constantly like eating wood and breaking down material and decomposing old trees and animal bodies, and they're one of Earth's decomposers. But with that, they're taking all of those nutrients and recycling it back into the soil and into our plants, and they're giving life. So they really are these bridges of life and death, and they take death and give it to life. They're so beautiful in the way that they do that. And really, without fungi, so many, if not all, of the ecological processes on our planet would not be possible. They're so incredible. They are really important nutrient cyclers. So for carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, they are really, really important in establishing healthy nutrient cycles in the soil. And I'm sure you all know that the NPK for our plants is really important. With fungi, if we have healthy balances of bacteria and fungi in the soil, oftentimes it's not even necessary to fertilize, because the fungi are the ones that are taking the nitrogen and making it available to the plants and really doing a lot of work in those nitrogen or those nutrient cycles. This is a pretty important part to know about fungi, and I was kind of touching on this, but there's, to just familiarize yourself more, there's kind of 3 main groups or classes of above ground fruiting body mushrooms. There's what we call saprotrophic, which literally just means feeding on dead or decaying organic material. So our saprotrophic mushrooms are usually the ones that we see in the grocery stores. There are oysters and shiitake and namiko and portobello and lion's mane. You know, our medicinal mushrooms like reishi and different conchs. These are all saprotrophic mushrooms. You know, if you break down the word sapro, meaning dead or dying, and trophic, meaning like to eat. So saprotrophic is a really important one. You'll often see these mushrooms growing on mulch or directly out of wood. They're very, very common and very necessary. Then we have our mutualistic mushrooms or our mycorrhizal mushrooms. These form what we call a mutualistic symbiosis with living plants. So instead of feeding on dead or dying or decaying plants or organic matter, the mycorrhizal fungi, they make partnerships with living plants. The mycelium of the fungus actually makes an association or a partnership with the roots of living plants. And it is a beautiful, incredible relationship. It's one of mycorrhizae, and the study of mycorrhizae is one of my absolute passions, because it's this whole underground network of communication and collaboration. And I'll talk more about mycorrhizae a little bit later in detail, but that's one of the classifications of fungi. And then we have our parasitic fungi as well. So when it comes to the ecological roles of mushrooms, they can really be categorized by the way that they eat. Because fungi literally live in their food, and then they consume the world around them. And it really defines their role in an ecosystem. Yep, and this is just a sweet little diagram talking about the different types of mushrooms and a couple examples. So like I said, reishis and different other conchs, they're the saprotrophs. Matsutake, if anyone has ever eaten or explored with matsutake, one of my favorite mushrooms, they are mycorrhizal. So they associate with different conifers. On the coast, they associate with pine. They also associate with tan oak in our region. So they're just really, really wonderful fungi. And then the morels too, they actually kind of bounce between being saprotrophic or mycorrhizal, depending on what they need, depending on like the context of what habitat that they're in. And it's not uncommon for mushrooms to kind of like bounce between different ways of feeding. It's really phenomenal. They're just such resilient and adaptable organisms, and really know how to live and how to thrive and adapt to their changing ecosystems. Here's a fun slide. Here are some very common garden mushrooms. There's so many different types of mushrooms. And I kind of did some research and I was like, well, which mushrooms do I often see in my garden? So these are all different types of mushrooms that you can see in the garden. None of these are harmful. However, their edibility hasn't been studied a lot, so I wouldn't necessarily eat any of these. But when you see these or any other mushrooms in your garden, it's usually a very, very good sign that you have a lot of organic matter present, that you're nice and mulched, and that you have like wood. And also it means that your soil is starting to like convert to being more fungally dominant, which is really, really great if you want to, have water retention and good nutrient cycling, different things like that. So here's just a couple very common garden mushrooms that we often see in our gardens here. And they're so fun. And when you really get to know them, they become friends, just like plants. They all have, their different characteristics and qualities and personalities, and they pop up and they're like, hey, I'm over here, and yeah, I'm over here. They're just so sweet.
Does it have to be damp?
Yes, absolutely. So that's a great question. One of the limiting factors in mushroom growth is water. Mushrooms need water to grow.
They cause
Their body, mushrooms themselves are actually 90% water. So they're very much water beings. So that's why in California, our winter is our mushroom season. When we have rain, then we have mushrooms. Over summer, you'll see very few to no mushrooms unless you're in an irrigated area. But if you're irrigating your landscape or your garden beds, then you might see mushrooms all year long. A lot of the endemic mushrooms in this region have actually acclimatized to colder temperatures, because when it rains here, it's cold. It's our winter. So a lot of the mushrooms here kind of like wet and cold. But there are some species that if in wet environments, they will fruit pretty much all year long. But yes, water is definitely very important for mushroom growth.
they kill everything.
This is a slide just to say, we're talking about mushrooms, but when you look at a plant, a lot of people think that, mushrooms are just associated with the roots or that they're, just in the soil, but it's now found that like fungi are everywhere. They are all over the plant. In certain trees and in most plant species, we now know that there are these fungi called foliar, epiphytic, and endophytic fungi. And these are fungi that actually live their entire lives in and on the leaves of plants. And they're these small, tiny, microscopic, non-mushroom forming fungi that are actually very essential for plant health. They help boost the plant's immune system. They help protect the plant from ultraviolet rays. A lot of these epiphytic fungi have been found to actually produce pigments that act as almost like a sunscreen for the plant to keep the plant from getting burnt. So in a lot of ways, when we look at a plant, we're also looking at fungi. There's like no differentiation anymore. There's fungi living in and on almost every surface of that plant. And this is
I don't like this fungi thing.
Huh?
Well, we got our malaria that lady said we have, and we're dragging. And the mushroom that we have kills everything. And she says it just kills the trees.
Well, our malaria might be parasitic, but fungi definitely don't kill everything. I promise that.
But
They're
this
really-
this is only deciduous trees.
It's deciduous trees, but it's also evergreens, it's conifers, it's also a lot of crop plants.
Okay.
A lot of crop plants also have these epiphytic fungi. This is just a diagram showing a tree. But yeah, these are being found more and more and more on like the surface of almost every single plant that is studied. It's really, really phenomenal. And it's kind of changing our notion of how we look at plants and how we look at botany as a whole. Now we're seeing that like botany and mycology kind of go hand in hand. And it's just really, really beautiful to see how intimately interwoven these worlds are, the worlds of the plants and the fungi and us. I'm going to skip through some of these. This is just showing how fungi really play a role in the soil food web. Fungi are breaking down that decaying plant material. If you go in the forest and in a wet forest and you turn over, any log, you'll probably see those white mycelium, those filaments all over that log. And that's because the fungi is doing the work to break down organic matter and reintroduce it back into the soil so that it can be food for the earthworms and the nematodes and the protozoa, and so that they can eat that nutrients and then, recycle it back into the system. So yeah, soil is this such a complex and beautiful and diverse, really an ecosystem within itself. It's like this living, breathing skin of our planet. And it's just really beautiful to see how many players, play a part in providing the habitat for our plants to grow. Even in our garden, the more life in the soil usually means the healthier your soil is, and then the healthier your plants will be. So we might all be familiar as well with, the conversations about carbon right now in our changing climate. But really, carbon is not a bad thing. I feel like carbon is often demonized, and people are like, "Oh, well, we should be lowering the amount of carbon." But really, carbon is the basis of life. Carbon is like the molecular glue of all of life. We are all, made out of carbon. Plants are made out of carbon. Fungi are made out of carbon. The world around us, the biological world, is carbon-based. And we just, put too much carbon in some places and not enough carbon in other places. So fungi help restore balance to that system. They, plants take in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then they make these really carbon-rich sugars that they then pump into their roots. And then the fungi can take those carbon sugars and use that as food and store that carbon in both their bodies and in the soil. So soil, healthy biologically active soil, is the second largest carbon sink in the world, after the oceans. The oceans do a lot of this work. But healthy soil is the largest terrestrial carbon sink. So if you have healthy soil, you're actually directly helping to fight climate change, which is really important. And if we're all doing our part to do that, it can make a really big difference. And I'm very much an advocate for that. Yeah, please go ahead. You're muted, Cynthia.
There, does that do it?
Yeah,
I recently removed like an old terrace of stones from an area, and under every flagstone, the mycelium was all these white webby roots, webby threads. And I just left them, and they were exposed to the sunlight. I was wondering what happens to those that are exposed to the sunlight. Do they break down and become part of the soil, or what happens to those? Do they die, or do they wait there until they get rain? What happens?
That's a great question. Yeah, it kind of depends on the different elements. If mycelium that are in a cool, damp environment are exposed to the sunlight, they will most likely dry out and desiccate. And then either they'll die, or they'll just send their energy to make new mycelium to go to find a suitable habitat to continue to live. So either they'll like dig deeper in the soil, or they'll go, find a new rock to crawl under. Mycelium are, well, the fungus itself is highly adaptable and arguably intelligent and conscious, and can actively sense, changes in their environment and adapt to those changes. So yeah, maybe the part of that mycelial network that you exposed will die, but maybe another part will live on in a different area. And then those dead mycelial threads will, yes, eventually just break down through the means of other bacteria and fungi that can eat the chitin, and then it will become nutrients and fertilizer for your soil.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for that question. I'm happy that you have mycelium in your soil on your land.
Bunches of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's another thing too that I wanted to mention. You know, it's really hard and pretty much impossible to identify what species of mushroom or what species of fungus you have just by their mycelium. You know, all mushroom forming fungi have that similar white thread material. It would be like trying to identify a plant by their root. It's like kind of hard. So until a mushroom, you know, expresses itself, it's almost impossible to tell, you know, what fungus you have on your land or in your garden until that mushroom comes, and then you can identify it. I just want to do a quick time check. How am I looking? How much longer do I have? What do you guys want to hear about?
Let's see, I think, does anybody have any opinions? Should we go for another 15 minutes or?
Oh, yes, please,
Keep
please.
going.
Yes.
Yes.
I guess they don't want you to stop ever.
Aw.
I'd love to hear
Yay.
more about mycorrhizae or
Great.
mycorrhizae. Yeah,
That's where we are right now.
good.
Yeah. Thank you all for your listening ears and your support and your excitement about this. It really just touches my heart as a fungal advocate to see people get excited and curious about fungi. So mycorrhizae, where do I begin? This is such a dear friend, really, it feels like to me now. And mycorrhizae comes from the root words myces or myco, which means fungus in Greek, and rhiza, which means root. So the word mycorrhizae literally means a root fungus or a fungus root. And the word speaks to what they are. These are mutualistic relationships, what we like to call obligate symbioses, which means that they are both dependent on one another to survive. Between the root of a plant and the mycelium of a fungus. And it's said now that over 90% of all plant families rely on these mycorrhizal fungi to grow, both to survive, also to germinate properly. So it's really incredible how necessary these mycorrhizal fungi are for our plant life, for our plant friends. It's now called the wood wide web, is a term for this relationship that was termed by an incredible woman named Suzanne Simard. She's a professor of forestry at the University of British Columbia. And she was really one of the first scientists that brought to light the dynamics of mycorrhizal relationships through her studying Doug fir trees and birch trees in the forests of British Columbia. I would highly recommend looking into her work and watching some of her videos if you're interested in mycorrhizae. She is phenomenal, and can really, break it down in a beautiful way.
Her name again, please.
Suzanne Simard, Simard.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, she's one of my biggest heroes. So she coined the term wood wide web, and this means literally that the trees in a forest are connected, just like the World Wide Web, just like our internet. They're connected in all of these different pathways that are created by the fungus. So imagine this picture that we see here of like a little pine sapling. The roots of this sapling, extend just right off of its main root branch. The roots itself don't extend very far, but off of these main plant roots, you see this like just ever expanding network of these very fine white filaments, and that's all mycorrhizal fungus. So the reach of the roots is, you know, extended by 10 to 1,000 times their normal length by the mycelium of these mycorrhizal fungi. So it's literally like just giving the plant so much more ability to gather nutrients and water and minerals through this relationship. And so imagine this pine seedling, and then imagine a pine seedling right next to it. Though their mycorrhizal networks, their extended systems will literally like fuse and create like transfer pathways. So a tree could send sugars and nutrients to another tree through this underground neural network. And to me, it really feels like it is, in a way, the neural network of our planet. You know, think of the function of our brains, like all these different neural pathways that are exchanging information and signaling, and even electrically signaling. The mycorrhizae are doing the same thing in the soil. They're taking information and even electric signals and passing it back and forth between different plants through these fungal transportation highways. It's just absolutely incredible. Yeah.
Surely
So,
you're talking about the book where the forests take over the world. There's a recent book, isn't there, where the trees and their interconnecting knowledge take over. You haven't read this book?
I'm not sure. Do you remember what?
Well, I'm just trying to remember the author.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. I would love to read that book. Any chance I get to learn more is just so delightful. But yeah, and you know, that doesn't surprise me, because I really think that in a lot of ways, like the neural network of our planet, these mycorrhizal networks, like they run the show. They really create the world that we live in and live on. Any time you walk through a forest, you are walking upon hundreds and hundreds of miles of these interconnected fungal plant networks that are living and breathing and sending electric pulses back and forth throughout the ground. Like, we live on this living earth. And it's just so humbling to bring this awareness. Every time we walk anywhere, we're walking upon this like living skin of our planet. This is a little bit technical, but it just gets into the types of mycorrhizae. So there's many different types. There's actually 6 different types of mycorrhizae, and all these different types contain many, many different genuses, or genera and species. But yeah, they're pretty specific. You know, each plant can have its own specific mycorrhizal associate. So it's a very complex and dynamic world. There are the 2 main kinds I would love to talk about are the ectomycorrhizae and the arbuscular mycorrhizae. And that really just means the ectomycorrhizae, the mycelium, forms around the cell of the roots, while the arbuscular mycorrhizae, the mycorrhizae or the mycelium penetrates the cell of the roots. So ecto meaning outside, the mycelium is around the roots, and then the arbuscular, the mycelium actually penetrates the roots of the cell. So like, yeah, how intimate is that? And these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, also known as AM fungi, are so important in all systems. They're pretty much found worldwide, in anywhere there's plant life and vegetation. So pretty much worldwide besides Antarctica, even in deserts, they found the presence of these mycorrhizal fungi that allow, different shrubs and very small plants to grow. And with the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that actually penetrate the cells of the roots of plants, they form these little kind of organelles, these little what's called arbuscules. So imagine in a root cell, the fungal mycelium is like creeping along, and then it penetrates this root cell and produces these arbuscules. And arbuscule translates literally to little tree. And so inside of the root cell, there's these little trees that the fungus is producing to exchange nutrients and carbon and water with the plants. And it's just so incredible to me. This is an image from an electron microscope. And it's so beautiful to me that something on such a small scale is mimicking these like larger processes. So in a tree are like hundreds of thousands of these little tiny trees produced by the fungus. It's just incredible how life mirrors itself. So, and the main dynamic of these mycorrhizal fungi too, if I didn't already explain it, the plant, as you all know, the plant is taking in sunlight and water and carbon dioxide, and through photosynthesis is making photosynthates, which are just these carbon sugars. And then the plant is sending that down through its roots, and the plant is exchanging these carbon-rich sugars to the fungus and kind of offering to the fungus in exchange for nutrients and minerals and water. So the fungus is really, really good at getting nutrients and minerals and water because it's like so branched and can reach so far into the bedrock. And it breaks down these nutrients and minerals and makes them in an accessible form for the plant. So the fungus brings these accessible forms of nutrients to the roots of the plants that otherwise the root of the plant wouldn't be able to access on its own. And that's their main exchange. So this is a very, very ancient relationship. And a lot of evolutionary biologists argue that this is how this mycorrhizal symbiosis is how land plants actually came onto land, over 400 million years ago. This is how like the very early photosynthesizing algae from the early oceans on the earth actually were able to come onto land through a relationship and association with fungus. So this has been going on for a very, very long time, and it's absolutely essential for so many of our plants, including, don't try to read all these plants right now, but this is just a list that shows how many of our plants are reliant on mycorrhizal fungi. So our endomycorrhizal plants, we have alfalfas and almonds and apples and cypresses, dogwood, eggplant, it goes on and on and on. So it really is so many of our plants that have and produce and interact in these ways with mycorrhizal fungus. And without these mycorrhizae, none of these plants would really be able to grow and live and produce fruits. Or produce fruits or nuts and seeds or whatever products you're getting from that plant. They're just highly important. And I really encourage deeper exploration when it comes to, figuring out which of your plants, especially trees, like what mycorrhizal fungi they need for their optimum health. Because nowadays you can go and buy different mycorrhizal applications. So they usually come in like powders or little pill-shaped kind of things. And you can inoculate your soil with mycorrhizae that will help your plants be happier.
I have a question.
Please.
What is the impact of our coming again drought on all of this? And how do they survive? How does the mycorrhizae, how do they cope with this? What do we do?
Yeah, that's a great question that I don't know if I have an exact answer for, because I don't know if, just any time we have a drought year, there's so many effects of that drought that are unprecedented. But what we can do, or what the mycorrhizae do, is they will actually adapt to the drier top layers of soil, and they'll actually extend, instead of like extending outwards horizontally through the soil, they'll actually dig deeper, like into the bedrock and into that water table. And they can actually help our plants be more drought resilient from extending all the way down into that water table and then bringing it up to the surface for the plants. So in drought years, there might be some effect to the mycorrhizae. Of course, they like wetter environments than drier environments. There's just more diversity in wetter environments, but the mycorrhizae actually can help our plants be more drought tolerant, and help them survive during stressful times and in stressful environments. But that being said, it's hard to know. It's hard to know exactly what we're going to see from this drought and what's going to happen. And yeah, it's a little bit scary. As a earth lover and as a water protector, I definitely have been feeling a lot of grief from the looming drought and the unprecedented effects that it's going to have on our on our landscapes, on our ecologies, on our gardens. I know a lot of people who aren't even gardening this year because they don't want to waste water. And it's like, it's a really hard decision to make because we all love our gardens. And yeah, there's a lot of questions I have there. More questions than answers.
Question.
Yeah.
What happens when we have the forest fires?
That's a great question. So my main line of work is actually doing ecological regeneration in post-fire ecosystems using fungi.
Really?
Yes, wow. I can go all the way to that slide. Sorry, these slides are a lot. So this is actually my main line of work. I work for a 501c3 nonprofit organization called CoRenewal. We do applied mycoremediation work all over California and in Ecuador as well. Doing oil and crude oil remediation in Ecuador in certain areas of the Amazon. But here, we do a lot of work with fungi and fire. And not a lot of people think about or talk about fungi and fire in the same sentence. But the work we're doing is after a fire, and especially with structure burns, it's so devastating when someone loses their home and like totally gets displaced by these fires, but it's becoming, unfortunately, more and more frequent and more common. But it's, there's the effect of the initial fire and the loss of the home. But what people don't often realize is that there's much longer lasting effects. When a house burns, all the different, paints and metals and chemicals that we live with, that also burns. And when the rain comes, all of those toxic materials wash off into the landscape and into our watershed and into our waters. So what we're doing as CoRenewal, we are going to these burn sites and we're actually laying down these straw wattles that you might have seen before on the sides of roads. They're usually like an erosion control measure, but we're laying down these straw wattles all along the sides of these burned houses, and we're inoculating these wattles with fungus so that when the rain comes and all this like toxic runoff comes off of these houses, it'll hit the wattle, and the fungus inside can actually help remediate some of those toxins. It can actually absorb the toxins or completely transform them to be no longer toxic. It's a superpower of a lot of these mushrooms. So that's one way we can help in our fire ecologies. But to answer your question more specifically, I work with a lot of colleagues that are doing work figuring out what is actually happening in the soil after some of these mega fires. And unfortunately, the mega fires, they burn so hot that they're destroying a lot of the biology in the soil. So some of these really fungally dense forests that were, that we once had, they will lose a lot of their fungal life, and it takes a very long time for them to regenerate back into that like fungal dominant successional stage. So it's a very, to be totally honest, it's very disheartening to have the awareness that when a fire moves through a forested landscape, that a lot of the fungi and a lot of that soil biology is dying along with it. And that makes it harder for, plants to regenerate in those areas until the bacteria and the fungi are present again in that soil.
How could the fungi be present again if everything is completely dried out? Because you said they need water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So usually when a fire moves through a landscape and it's during the summer, you won't see any regrowth of anything unless there's a spring system. But once that water comes, like I said earlier, mushrooms and fungi, they are sending out spores like wild. There are like hundreds of thousands of spores in the air that we breathe in every moment. So eventually in these burned landscapes, when water is present, the spores from far, far away will fly over and land on the soil and begin to regenerate. So the land kind of like re-inoculates itself in a way. Some of the work that we've been doing along with the filtration of toxic ash with fungi, we've also been doing work to like bring back mycorrhizal fungi into the soil from unburned ecosystems. So we'll like go into unburned ecosystems and culture native mycorrhizal fungi and actually help bring it to burned areas to kind of kickstart that soil biology and that ecological succession.
Taylor?
Yeah.
I think I'm sorry to interrupt you. This
is okay.
Wonderful, but we are running pretty late, so I think it's good time to come to a close.
Great.
Taylor, I wonder if you could finish by letting people know what mushrooms are good to grow in their garden, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of my main things I want to talk about. But like you see, it's easy to get sidetracked. Yeah, so just briefly talking about some of my favorite mushrooms to grow in the garden. One of them is the one you see right here. This is Stropharia rugoso annulata, also called the garden giant, the king Stropharia, or the burgundy wine cap. They are a beautiful and very easy mushroom to grow in your garden. Really all you have to do is get a spawn bag of Stropharia like this. This is my Stropharia mycelium. In this bag is just some sawdust with the white filaments of Stropharia mycelium growing on it. And what I do commonly is just make these mushroom beds, which is just layers of cardboard and mulch and straw. And then you sprinkle the spawn in all those layers, and you can grow your very own Stropharia at home or in your garden. One thing I love to do is when I'm mulching like a garden bed or mulching paths, I will literally just sprinkle Stropharia spawn directly in that mulch, and they make a great garden companion mushroom. So they actually help break down woody debris, and they help cycle nutrients in the soil. And they're a great kind of like understory companion to have in your garden.
But Taylor, do you mean that like these would be to eat?
Absolutely. Yep. So the Stropharia are edible and medicinal mushrooms. They're really, really tasty. They taste something like portobello, but a little bit more nutty in my opinion. So yeah, this is a great way to incorporate an edible fungus in your garden that just like benefits both you and your plants and the soil. It just makes for a really happy garden.
Oh, what fun.
Yeah, it's a great companion mushroom to also put in. I'm sure you all have heard of the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash. I like to do 5 queens and a king, which is corn, beans, squash, sunflower, bee balm, and then inoculate the mulch underneath it with Stropharia. So it's like the 5 queens of the plants and then the king denoting King Stropharia. And it's such a beautiful collaborative garden bed to have. And it's really fun and very fairy-like and mystical. Yeah. Okay, I guess another quick thing I'll say about incorporating fungi in the garden is one of my favorite ways to cultivate and grow fungi is through log cultivation. And this is a very ancient form, one of the oldest forms of cultivating fungi. And it's so natural and regenerative because you're just taking logs and inoculating it with fungi. And then eventually the fungal mycelium will eat its way through all that wood, and then the fungi will fruit out, just like you can see in this picture of some logs at our mushroom farm. These are shiitake growing right out of a log that we planted. Yeah, and you know, I could get really into like how, like step by step, how to do this process, but it's fairly easy. It's very low maintenance once you get them going, and it's very self-explanatory. It's like low cost, low tech, and you can get a whole bunch of really delicious edible mushrooms, and you know, do a lot of creative things with those logs. You can like line your garden beds with inoculated logs, and then have mushrooms popping out of your garden beds. Or you can make hugelkultures with them. I don't know if any of you practice hugelkultures, but it's a really great thing to do with inoculated logs. And even if the logs are not inoculated, even having wood in as like a mound in the base of your garden bed will attract fungi into the soil, which will break down that wood and release nitrogen and carbon into the soil and create for a very happy plant community. So those are my 2 favorite ways, very easy ways to incorporate fungi in the garden. But you can also take, yeah, like spent substrate. If you have a mushroom farm that's local to you, you can take spent mushroom substrate, which a lot of conventional mushroom farms will just like throw out all of their old substrate, but that actually makes incredible compost and mulch. Yeah, so because it like feeds other little microorganisms in the soil, and it's just, yeah, dense with nutrients that will eventually leach into the soil and leach into your plants or be transmuted to your plants. One of my favorite mushroom farms to get this material from is Far West Fungi. I highly recommend looking into them. They will pretty much throw out their spent substrate blocks. And they have these big mounds, these piles in the back of their facility that you can go and just get these blocks from that will continue to produce mushrooms for many months. And you can just lay those, right underneath your plants in your garden. And then there'll be mushrooms growing out of them. And then eventually they'll just decompose into like rich compost.
And where are they located?
They're located, sorry, I forgot to mention, in Moss Landing. So like just south of Santa Cruz.
Hey, you guys, I'm going to do a group order, and I'm going to be sending out a sign up sheet and some way for you guys to pay. And Far West Fungi is giving us an offer of half price for their mini farms. So you can buy one of these blocks.
Oh, great.
That's so exciting.
And
Yeah,
also I may add the option of maybe if you guys want some spent mushroom blocks, I may see if I can pick those up. But I'm going to have to make a drive to South San Francisco. So I hope not everybody orders 10 blocks because it's not going to fit in my car. But
Well, wait a minute. Are they in South San Francisco or Moss Landing?
the warehouse where I pick up these blocks are going to be in South San Francisco, but the growing farm is in Moss Landing.
Oh, interesting.
yeah, they do have a pop-up shop in at a market in San Francisco, like in the Fisherman's Wharf, I believe.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, there's one here. It says Ferry Building.
Yeah, there you go. They have
They're
a
also
there.
they also come to all of the local farmers market. Like on Sunday, you can see them at Mountain View Farmers Market.
Oh, great.
I have a question. Oh, I'm on mute. Wait a second.
I can hear you.
Okay. I want to know what technology caused this explosion, as far as I'm concerned, of knowing these tiny things. What happened when? But you mentioned an electron microscope. I want to know who thought of putting the stuff under the electron microscope and when.
That's a great question, and not one I think I can answer in a linear order. People have been studying fungi for a very long time, but not as long as we may think. Mycology is really a growing science and has only been its own field for about 100 years. A lot of Asian cultures have been cultivating mushrooms and studying mushrooms and using mushrooms as medicine for thousands of years. But really, like in America, in the States, we've only been scientifically studying mushrooms for about a century. And then, with the advent of microscopy, using microscopes to look at small things, there's many names I could mention that have kind of pioneered the world of mycology. So yeah, I'm drawing a blank on some of the specific names right now.
That's okay. I just was wondering how old the technology is, and obviously it's very old. Where have I been? And I have another question, which escaped me. Darn it! Oh yes. What about critters in the garden? I have been plagued with I don't know what, raccoons, rats, squirrels, and I've had to put ammonia rags out to discourage these critters, and I'm probably killing all the micro stuff. But I want to do those critters like to eat the mushrooms, or what? Are they threatened by any of those predators? What is their protection?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes, yeah, I've seen squirrels and raccoons eat some mushrooms before. Usually, though, the thing that happens though is that mushrooms can sometimes attract slugs, but there's also it's just like slugs would be attracted to any other plant. There's not like an additional encouragement of slugs to come, and then it's like the critters that eat the bugs and the slugs that are attracted to the mushrooms. But mostly I find that they attract more birds than anything. because the critters, you know, come to the mushrooms, and then the birds will jump down and pick them off and eat them. But then it's like you're inviting bird droppings into your garden, which is super high in nitrogen. So it kind of creates its own little ecosystem. But if you do have any problems, like really big rat and squirrel and raccoon problems, then maybe I would recommend keep making your mushroom bed in like a separate bed, not incorporating it directly in the garden beds, but in a separate little bed, and then get a little like a chicken wire cage for it, because sometimes raccoons will come and kind of like dig up the bed and like dig up your mycelium and eat all the little critters that it attracts. And one other thing I wanted to say to your previous question too, you know, mycology is a fairly young science in the Western world, but indigenous peoples all over the world, especially in Asia, but where my ancestry hails from, which is Northern Europe and Iceland and Norway, as well as the indigenous peoples of America. You know, they have been studying mushrooms for a very, very long time and have deep, deep roots in indigenous practices with mushrooms, using them for medicine and food. Of course, you know, microscopes didn't exist back then, so they didn't have the ways to look at these mushrooms so technically. But yeah, mushroom ethnomycology and mushroom use in cultures all around the world is an ancient practice. And in some cultures, mushrooms are highly, highly revered.
Thank
Do
you.
you,
Thank you.
do you suggest a specific powder, a brand name, or a type of mycorrhizal fungal addition to your soil?
Yeah, mycorrhizal applications, from the website that I showed you guys, I believe here, let me go back to that slide. Mycorrhizal applications, you can go to www.mycorrhizae.com. And then they make a really good kind of like very general mycorrhizal application. But yeah, what's the other one? I think the other one's called like Mycomatrix is another good mycorrhizal application. But if you go online and look up like general mycorrhizal applications to put into your soil, there's many, many different types. And now a lot of soil mixes, like bagged soil mixes, are including these mycorrhizal fungi in the mix already. People are really tuning in to the importance of these mycorrhizal fungi. So yeah, we're catching up.
Thank you, Taylor. I think it's time for us to call it quits. And
Okay.
I appreciate this. Was wonderful.
Yeah, and please feel free if you have more questions, which I know you probably do. Feel free to contact me. If you can still see my screen, my contact info is right here. Email me at taylorleland@gmail.com, and I'm so happy to help. Yeah, answer any other questions you have and help in any way I can. I do lots of cultivation consultations and just love to help people be inspired by fungi.
Thank you so much, Taylor.
Thank you.
Really
Thank
appreciate all this.
Thank you all so much for listening and going on that journey with me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Grace.
Lots of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jean, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, so I don't know if are we still going to do breakouts rooms, or is it too late for that?
I'm willing to stay around if there are people who want to do this. That would be fine.
Okay, I'm not going to be here. I actually am running late now for an appointment, so I won't be involved, but just thank you. Go right ahead. That's great.
Okay. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Yeah, I'm gonna hop off, but thank you everyone so much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
If people want to hang around, we can do breakout rooms for whoever's left. Give you a minute or so to sign off and then see who's left. You might want to, if you're going to stay, take yourself off mute and display your picture. Turn on video. And if everybody leaves, there may be just enough of us we can not
I
do
think
it.
there's enough of us to just all talk over each other, Jean.
Yes.
People have fled
No.
very rapidly.
So, yeah, I think this is it. There's Pat, Bobby, Priscilla, who's left the room, but I assume she might be back. Barbara, Judy, and you and me, Grace, and Glenn. Glenn, are you there? You need to unmute. Glenn may be asleep. So we're here. We're it. Unless you, yeah, we're it. So Judy, it's nice to see you. I'm glad you.
I came in late and I have a very heavy case of oak root fungus all throughout my yard. Did she talk about that?
Yeah, somebody was really insistent on asking her questions about that.
I think it's just, you live with it, you know?
Yeah, I guess one thing you can do